You're listening to the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn, and also Dr. George Szamuely and Martin J. And we're going to be looking at false flags. Well, throughout history, some of the most pivotal moments have been shrouded in deception. Governments and militaries have often resorted to a sinister tactic known as the false flag. Well, what's that? It's basically a calculated political or military action designed to deceive. And what happens is by staging or simulating attacks on their own side, nations can create a convenient scapegoat, justifying their aggressive moves. Now, the term was first used, actually, been doing my bit of research on this, in the 16th century to describe how pirates would fly the flag of a friendly nation to deceive merchant ships into allowing them to draw near. And false flag histories have basically had a long and ignoble history. And you think it might just all be made up? Well, there's a declassified 1962 document which reveals what's called Operation Northwoods. And that was a chilling plan which was considered by the Kennedy administration. And basically this plan proposed fabricating terror attacks, including bombings and hijackings in American cities like Miami and Washington, D.C., to justify an invasion of Cuba. The operation, which involved killing innocent people and planting false evidence, was ultimately vetoed by President Kennedy, who released the documents to the public. But it does show that they are there. George, introduce me to this. What are your takes on false flags?
Well, of course, there's always a need for powers to provide a pretext for going to war, and therefore, when it's lacking, then you have to manufacture an incident. So, let's take an example of the German attack on Poland on September the 1st, 1939. Well, Germany, despite all the belligerent talk of Hitler against the Poles, he used all the Poles were mistreating the Germans, the Poles mistreating the Russians, and so on. He still didn't really have a pretext. He wanted this war, but he needed a pretext, so he had to manufacture one. He had to manufacture a supposed Polish attack, a Polish incursion across the German border that provided him with the pretext to, it's a retaliation. And that's really the point. Now, you talk about this Operation Northwoods. Well, the reason why these Joint Chiefs were working on kind of manufacture all sorts of terrorist incidents that could then be attributed to Cuba was that they didn't really have any pretext. I mean, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, they had the pretext there, not a very plausible, but that these were Cubans who were really, really very, very upset about the communists coming to power in Cuba. And so they planned this invasion to take Cuba back from the communists. But of course, it ended in debacle. But at least I had this was the American pretext. Well, we didn't have anything to do with it, but we just had these Cubans with this very zealous anti-communist. But after that failure, they had to come up with something new to knock over Castro. So they came up with this plan. Well, we'll stage these terrorist incidents. We'll stage attacks against American targets. And then that would provide a pretext for the U.S. invasion. Let's keep in mind the deal that was struck following the Cuban Missile Crisis involved the Americans pledging not to attempt to invade Cuba again. So the issue that somehow Kennedy vetoed this or anything, well, that was the deal. I mean, with Khrushchev, removing the missiles from Cuba, America removes the missiles from Turkey and Italy, and a part of the deal was no more attempts at invasion of Cuba. So there wasn't really some noble thing that Kennedy, this is shocking, we can't really do this. No, this was part of the deal with Khrushchev.
Martin?
Yeah, it's very much about public opinion. And George is right to use the word pretext. And not always we have a pretext to go to war. The Americans have proved that they have a long history of false flags, as that report that you alluded to showed. And we're quite happy to deflect blame to whoever was conveniently there. If we remember in 1964, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin, whereby the Americans claimed that they'd been under attack by North Vietnamese Navy, torpedo attack. It turned out to be completely fake, totally fabricated, because LBJ at the time wanted a context, and he didn't have the support of the people. He couldn't explain it to the people why he wanted to get into North Vietnam, why he wanted to. The argument at the time was that we can't allow rogue states in the region to become an example for communism, because it will spread, and so we need to nip it in the bud. And that was the ideology at the time. But it was a lie. It was no question about it. It was a lie, and Americans seem to be very susceptible to this more than Europeans, I've noticed. Americans tend to be more patriotic and more naive, I found. I recently had a dinner party here in Marrakesh with a group of American journalists, but veteran American journalists, all in their 60s, from all the big titles. I won't name them. And they shocked me because they thought my ideas about 9/11 were quite hysterical and conspiracy theory, and because they found it so very, very hard to conceive the idea that 9/11 could have been an inside job, simply because their naive and patriotic ideology just clashed with the idea that that was something that other countries did around the world, that not America couldn't do that. But if we take false flag attacks, false flag attacks are becoming increasingly important because we tend to, in the West, start wars, but it's always becoming harder and harder for our leaders to justify why we continue in such wars. And that's the case for Ukraine, definitely. Most people, rightly or wrongly, and I would argue wrongly, believed that we needed to go to war with Russia because of the so-called invasion. But they didn't want to look at the history. They didn't want to look at the nuance of it. They didn't want to look at the 2004, 2014 elections, where we essentially installed our own Western puppet and cranked up the atmosphere by talking about NATO expansion, EU membership, and so forth. So when we look at Ukraine now, there is a very strong impetus, I say. There is a very much a reason for the West, for the Ukrainians, and for the West to create more false flag attacks. There have been a number over the last few months. I was very suspicious, very skeptical of just a couple of weeks ago, we had the NATO celebrations, the NATO birthday in Washington. And just 2 days before it, there was a massive attack by Russia on Kiev, you might remember. And one of the locations that was bombed was a children's hospital. And I remember thinking to myself, why would Russia do that? That can only create bad publicity, bad image around the world. Western journalists, of course, seized that. And then I asked myself, maybe the Russians did attack. Maybe they had a blitz of several locations, but the Ukrainians took advantage of that to actually bomb their own hospital, their own kids' hospital themselves. I know, completely far-fetched, you might say, but we have to ask that question. We have to, because there is a lot of talk now on both sides of false flag attacks. And for a long time, there has been a claim by Russia that the Ukrainians have been trying to carry out false flag attacks on a nuclear power station, which is being controlled by Russia. I'm not even going to try and pronounce the name of it. George will know it. And I think false flag attacks in Ukraine are going to be inevitable in the coming months, absolutely inevitable, and we should expect them. And I also think that when we talk about false flag attacks, it's impossible not to talk about October the 7th, which I've always believed from the very beginning. I've never swallowed completely hook, line, and sinker that Netanyahu knew nothing about it at all. I've never believed that. I've always believed that he probably knew that it was coming. But I go further in my articles, which people can read on Patreon. I've said in my own opinion pieces that I believe that it was orchestrated by the Israelis. I think the Israelis pushed Hamas more and more and more, knowing there would be a breaking point, and they were ready for the breaking point. And everything that happened on that day and consequent to that day, I think the Israelis are completely in control of and had a premeditated plan installed. And also, we can't really talk about false flag attacks without talking about 9/11, because 9/11 for me was probably one of the greatest false flag attacks we've really had in American history. I mean, nothing really compares to it. And, the extraordinary approach from Western media towards 9/11 should make a lot of Americans very, very suspicious. But, to swallow the narrative completely that we're dished out, is very hard for me. I think most of what we're told about 9/11 isn't true. And even how the buildings came down, even the jets themselves, I mean, there are now pretty strong evidence to show that those jets had some sort of attachment on their undercarriage. We've seen the video footage, the fact that the attacks were carried out on the same day that the Pentagon had war games where they simulated planes flying into buildings. And so the F-16s that would normally be scrambled to intercept those 4 planes didn't intercept them at all, not even 5 minutes, not even 10 minutes. Normally it was just a matter of minutes before they would have been engaged. There was confusion all over. None of the emergency services or military knew what they were doing because no one would work out what was real, what was a drill. The list, Andrew, just goes on and on and on. And even the forensic stuff, how those buildings came down. I can't be the only skeptical Western journalist who has looked at dozens and dozens and dozens of testimonials by architects who have experienced and controlled explosions and who said there's only one way those buildings could come down. You can't heat cast iron girders up to you need to heat them up to 2,000 degrees before they melt. And they were nowhere near that. They were at 700, 800 degrees, and the actual way that those buildings came down, and even Building 7, which wasn't even touched by it, it was all very, very suspicious. But a false flag attack, which benefited who? I mean, this is what we should be asking. You like to talk about asking tough questions. Well, who benefited from 9/11? I mean, George Bush Jr. certainly benefited from 9/11. It was his wish to move into Iraq and into Afghanistan. It was the wish of his father as well. And the people he had around him, like Cheney and others from those neocons who had worked for his father, they all wanted to get into Iraq and Afghanistan. And they also wanted a second term for him. But I think if you ask the more pressing, salient question, who benefited in the region, in the Middle East, we can't look at that false flag attack without looking at the Israeli dimension to it. Israel certainly benefited from it. The Israelis, for a long, long time, had been very concerned that the American public were actually taking their eye off the ball and no longer being so concerned about the so-called Muslim extremist threat in the Middle East, and in particular, Hamas or Fatah in relation to what was going on in Israel. And so to stir up this massive amount of anti-Muslim hatred at that particular time, you are going to be called a conspiracy theorist if you point the finger at Israel, but I don't think we can dismiss Israel. We have to look at Israel as one of the suspects. So, false flag attack, which is probably going to go down in history as something completely unprecedented and one that has not even been resolved to this day. And, I think perhaps people have talked about Lockerbie in this regard. I don't think Lockerbie is a false flag attack, but it's something that people may well look at in a similar vein. We may well look at that on other shows, but 9/11 for me and what's going on in Ukraine, and to summarize what's happening now from October the 7th in Israel and the ethnic cleansing, these are all false flag attacks, which journalists just aren't uncovering. They just aren't probing. And I think that's given confidence to the people who carry out those attacks. They can just say, well, look at media. We've got media in our pocket. What's our next false flag attack? So I'm expecting, and I've written it in my opinion pieces, which people can read on Patreon. I've predicted that in Netanyahu's case in Israel, the options for him are running out. His only option now is a false flag attack. So remember, you heard it here on Muckrakers.
And I think, and we often make the point that here on Muckrakers, we absolutely will ask the questions that others won't ask. And the reason we want to put it into historical context is a lot of people say, well, of course people don't bomb their own people or attack their own people, until you turn around and say, well, there's been a number of examples. I mean, I want to just take get your take on this, George, about the Reichstag fire, which was an arson attack on the Reichstag building, home of the German parliament, on Monday, the 27th of February, 1933. It's precisely 4 weeks before Adolf Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. What do you know about the sort of evidence surrounding whether that was a false flag operation?
Well, most historians, I think, now accept that this was this crazy Dutchman, van der Lubbe, who set fire to the Reichstag, that it wasn't a Nazi operation. Now, what then happened is, of course, that Hitler seized on the Reichstag fire to introduce essentially a Nazi dictatorship into Germany. But I don't think there's ever really been any serious evidence presented that this was actually, van der Lubbe was actually working for the German government. And that, I think, is a very important distinction one always has to make, which is that there are events that take place and interested parties exploit the events for their own ends. That doesn't mean that they actually did it themselves. There are cases when they did do it themselves, but that doesn't mean that they engineered it themselves. So let's say the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor, you can certainly say the Americans were asleep at the switch. Now, was it absent-mindedness, or was this a deliberate attempt by FDR to get America into the war? And he had every intelligence information available to him of an impending Japanese attack, but he chose not to do anything about it. He chose not to make any preparations, and essentially Japan, basically a very backward country relative to the United States, got absolutely a clean hit on the U.S. Pacific Fleet on December the 7th, 1941. So that's the issue. You always have to kind of separate, the exploitation of an event, which is what the Nazis did over the Reichstag, what FDR did at Pearl Harbor. Now, the same goes for the Tonkin Gulf incident, because although there really nothing happened there, and that it's the story was basically cooked up that there was a North Vietnamese attack on U.S. ships, the United States lied about it and used this as a pretext for launching the bombing of North Vietnam. But that didn't mean that the Americans actually staged an attack on themselves. They just lied about it and said that there was a North Vietnamese attack on the United States. But the interesting cases were, of course, in Yugoslavia during the 1990s, because there were basically three almost identical marketplace bombings in Sarajevo. There was one in 1992, one in 1994, and then one in 1995. Now, what was interesting about each of these incidents is that they happened always on the eve of some critical event. So in the case of 1992, it was on the eve of a UN Security Council debate on Yugoslavia. And then the question was going to be, is the UN going to impose sanctions on Yugoslavia? And there were a number of member states that were not, happy with imposing sanctions. They didn't really think Yugoslavia had done anything wrong. Milosevic had complied with everything that had been required of him. He had withdrawn his forces, or Yugoslavia had withdrawn its forces from Bosnia and Herzegovina. But with that bombing, there was such emotional outrage that the sanctions were imposed. And in 1994, there was on the brink, they were absolutely on the brink of signing a peace deal between the Tudjman and Izetbegovic and Karadzic. It was going to be basically a kind of cantonization of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Izetbegovic, the Muslim leader, was very unhappy about this. And lo and behold, the worst of all of the Makale massacres takes place. And again, outrage, Izetbegovic walks out. And then, of course, there was one, I think Martin's talked about before, the one in 1995, which was, again, identical place. Again, immediately blamed on the Serbs. And that was the pretext that the Americans wanted to launch the bombing campaign. But what was interesting about it is that the journalists, the media, the U.S. government, and the NATO governments always blame the Serbs. Immediately say, "Oh yeah, the Serbs did it. The UN inspectors on the ground said, "Really, I don't think they did. I don't think the Serbs could have done this. I mean, they're just too far from Sarajevo to be able to make such an accurate missile attack. Same place. It just couldn't be done." And there was evidence that the bombs had actually been planted there in the marketplace. But the question was, again, they immediately attributed this to the Serbs. And then going back to Ukraine, remember the key event in Ukraine. You remember there were the Maidan protests that went on month after month, the winter of 2013 and 2014. But what really set everything on edge and what really brought down Yanukovych, and then why the Western powers said, "Oh well, this is the end for Yanukovych," was these assassinations. Suddenly, there were these rooftop snipers who were just shooting at people in the crowd, and then lo and behold, you said 100 people were dead, and of course, it was immediately attributed to Yanukovych. That it was Yanukovych's forces who were the snipers on the roof, and of course, it became clear very quickly that it was, of course, the opposition that had actually placed the snipers. That the building from where the shots were coming from was controlled by the opposition. And the EU said us, we have this phone conversation where basically EU, Catherine Ashton, who was the foreign minister of the EU at the time, was told, no, we can hear that phone conversation. No, it wasn't the government forces that were responsible for these sniper attacks. And she just basically shrugged her shoulder. Hey, well, we've moved on from there. Who cares who did it? So that, you can see, once you create this, and then afterwards, when people want to investigate and say, yeah, I don't think this has happened the way it did, well, it's already too late. We've already moved on to the next thing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's peddling that misinformation and looking at the reasons why. And the reason I say we're laboring these history points, if you like, is because it will make it more realistic that this is still happening today.